Well, hello everybody, welcome back again to our next chapter. This is chapter 9 on inheritance, and we're going to look initially at the work of an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel. Some of you may have heard of him, particularly if you've done some biology in the past. You almost certainly have looked at his work, and we are going to look very briefly at his work. Well, maybe not so briefly. One of the things that I want to point out to you is that there is a lot of information in this chapter. It is very information dense. I'm not entirely sure why the authors of the textbook decided to put all of this information into a single chapter. It really would benefit from being spread over 2 chapters, but they put it into 1 chapter. So that means that there are a lot of things that we need to cover with respect to this chapter. So this presentation is kind of long. I will warn you that it is kind of long, but I have broken it up into many smaller chunks. So if I remember rightly, there are about 6 chunks in total. So my best advice to you as you are starting to look at this presentation is to not try and sit here and look at all of it at once. Give yourself some breaks, and I've tried to make some convenient breaks in between topics so that you can walk away and have some time to think, clear your head, try and put things in perspective before you come back and take a look at the next section. That being said, if you do choose to watch all of it, or if you do choose to watch multiple sections at once, pay attention to the concept check questions, because those focus on some of the things that you might very well be asked to do in exam questions. Because one of our favorite things to do as biology professors is to ask you genetics questions and ask you to try and figure out probabilities and all sorts of things. So I've tried to include some questions in the concept check sections where we take our breaks that will focus on solving genetics problems and give you some clues as to how to go about solving genetics problems. And then I also have, as part of my worksheet set, my review sheet set, a couple of worksheets, in fact, that focus on doing genetics problems and solving genetics problems, because they are one of the favorite things that we like to do as college professors in our exams when we cover this section. So you'll see that throughout the course of this presentation. So having given you that lead in, let's get started, because we've got a ways to go in this chapter. So one of the things that we will come back and take a look at several times throughout the course of this chapter is the human relationship with dogs. We don't know exactly when dogs decided to live with humans, because that's almost certainly what happened. Or at least the ancestors of dogs decided to spend time around humans. It's likely that this started out as some sort of accidental relationship, but over a relatively short period of time, it appears, that relationship became more strongly reinforced, and eventually dogs chose to live with humans, and that relationship has developed with time so that dogs and humans are now able to interact with each other at levels that perhaps no other 2 species could interact with each other. And if you've ever had a dog, you know what I'm talking about. Dogs have this ability to be able to read our emotions and read what we are thinking. And I mean that in exactly the same way that I'm saying it. They somehow understand where we are at, even if we can't talk to them and explain things to them, which obviously we can't. They still seem to be able to read us like an open book. And to some degree, we can do the same thing, although nowhere near as well as they can do it for us. And there's some interesting videos on YouTube I'll try and make sure that I've got at least a link to one of them that talks about an experiment that took place in the Soviet Union, or as it was then, the Soviet Union. And in fact, it is still very much an ongoing proposition, because the research institute that was established to do this is still in existence, and they're still working with the foxes / dogs that they originally were set up to start working with. And basically, the geneticist who was placed in charge by Joseph Stalin was given the job of creating a fox that was easy to work with, because they were using the pelts of the foxes in the fur trade. And the foxes, being wild animals, tended to have a negative attitude towards people, biting hands and things like that. And so this geneticist was tasked with the job of creating a fox that would be easier to work with. And so he basically just started selecting foxes that were less aggressive towards people and introduced those into his breeding program, and continually selected for foxes that were more accommodating and more accepting of humans, and showed an interest in humans. And over a course of about 7 to 10 generations at the most of breeding foxes just for their acceptance of humans, he changed the whole makeup of that fox, of those foxes. They used to be black with a silver tip, and they were actually called silver-tipped foxes. Over the course of selecting for simply being friendly towards humans, they developed a black and white fur. Their ears, and you've seen fox ears, they are erect and they come to a point. These became really floppy. You've seen a fox's tail. And a fox's tail tends to be very bushy. These, the tails on these foxes over time, over the course of this 10 generations of breeding, of selective breeding, became less bushy. The foxes started to interact with humans, deliberately interact with humans, rather than the humans having to force the interaction. The foxes started to want to interact with humans. And eventually it got to the point where they would answer to their own names and come when they were called, and they would bark and carry on. In other words, these foxes turned into proto-dogs. And remember, the only thing that the geneticist was breeding for was being accepting of humans. Nothing else. Everything else came as part of a package. Even though it wasn't being bred for, it turned up as part of breeding for being more friendly to humans. And that is likely the history of dogs, that they started out simply as either foxes or wolves. We think that's where they came from, probably wolves. That, for reasons which we don't fully understand, decided that humans were someone to hang out with. Possibly it had something to do with an easy source of food, but these were wolves that were more accepting of being around humans, whereas wild wolves today really don't want to have anything to do with humans. And then over time, as these wolves became more accepting of humans and simply started to adopt humans as part of their pack sort of thing, the makeup of the wolf started to change and it became more dog-like. We think that's possibly what happened. Certainly there's a significant body of evidence that supports this. Whether it happened only once or whether it happened multiple times in multiple locations, we have no idea. But once we started this interaction with dogs, then you can see what humans immediately started to do. Once they had the ability to selectively breed dogs, then they started to do so, selecting for particular characteristics and traits and behaviors that they wanted to see in their dogs. And so ultimately we now have multiple species of dogs that we recognize. Well, actually not species, we call them breeds. We would call them species if they were the product of natural selection, but because they are the product of human intervention, we don't use the term species, we use the term breed to differentiate between what would occur naturally versus what we have created as a result of what we've done. But this is an ongoing genetics experiment, and it continues to this very day with people continuing to breed dogs in various ways, and in some cases actually creating designer species because of the requirements for things like hypoallergenic fur, different types of behaviors and that sort of thing. It is, again, an ongoing genetics experiment. And we have some idea of what we're doing, but in many cases, not so much. And that has led to a lot of issues in terms of the outcomes of some breeding experiments, particularly, or just breeding. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what to say, but where you've got people who don't really understand the concept of breeding and the concept of bad breeding, it has in fact affected some of these breeds of dogs, and they now have, unfortunately, a lot of genetically determined issues as a consequence of people breeding and misbreeding dogs for particular characteristics. We might talk a little bit more about that when we come back and revisit dogs later in the presentation. So let's start talking about inheritance, because when we start thinking about inheritance, we particularly start thinking about patterns of inheritance. There is one person that we always begin with, irrespective of where we go after that. There is always one person that we begin with, and that is Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk. Now, Mendel did all of his work in the city of Brno, which is found in the Czech Republic today, but was at the time part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is the reason why he is referred to as an Austrian monk, because he was his town was in a part of the Austrian Empire. And Mendel became a monk by choice, because as the second son of his family, if he wanted to receive an education and make something of his life, that was basically the only option that he had, because his older brother was the one who was going to inherit the farm and everything else. And so he became a monk, and having become a monk, he was sent off to college and to university to get a degree. And he got a lot of training in mathematics and some training in science and some training in biology. And it was the fact that he had all of this background that made him the right person at the right time to do these experiments. And he didn't do this accidentally. This was quite a deliberate choice on the part of the abbot who ran the monastery at the time, and Mendel. The abbot actually spent a substantial amount of money to build Mendel a modern greenhouse so that he could do his work. And if you go to the monastery, which is still in existence, you can see the footprint of the foundations of Mendel's greenhouse in the lawn. I've actually been there. And there is a little museum there, and you can go and learn more about Mendel, who he was, and the work that he did, because they are very proud of Mendel, both in the monastery and on a wider arena in Brno itself. There are a number of different parts of the town that have connections to Mendel, and there are streets and squares. One of the local universities is named after Mendel. So they're quite proud of Mendel. And basically, he started out from a position of what happens when two individuals have offspring. what is the basis for the characteristics and the traits that those offspring have, given the parents that they are produced by. Now, he had some understanding of the basic notion of inheritance, because people did have some ideas about inheritance. And remember, Mendel learned some biology when he was at university. So it wasn't as if this was not something that he was uninterested in. It was actually something he was quite interested in. But he was of the opinion that apparently, that the commonly held idea, which was known as blending, was probably not the best explanation of inheritance patterns. What the best explanation was, he'd had no idea. And he did go in with pretty much an open mind, but he was fairly confident that the explanation that was currently held, the notion of blending, where the characters or the traits of an offspring were the blend of the traits of the parents. So, for instance, there is a flower that we will talk about a little bit later called the snapdragon, and you can get red snapdragons and white snapdragons. And if you breed the red and white snapdragons together, what you wind up with are pink snapdragons. And it doesn't take much imagination to realize that the pink is a blend of the red and white. You've done that with watercolor paints when you were a child. If you wanted pink paint and you didn't have any, then you mix the red and the white together to get pink. That's the notion of blending. And Mendel was not convinced that blending was the best explanation. What he was able to show was that, in fact, what he referred to initially as inheritance particles, the book says heritable factors. In fact, he used the term inheritance particles, were just that. And the notion of the idea of particle was part of his thinking, that these particles remain discrete. That's what he was able to show, that in fact, whatever was being inherited, and the term gene would not be invented until around 1930, so it would be much later that the term gene would come into widespread use. So the idea of inheritance particles was Mendel's explanation, and he deliberately used the term particle because, as we know, particles tend to be coherent and indivisible. They remain discrete. And that was his understanding of inheritance based on his experiments. And it was the passing of these inheritance particles from one generation to the next that determined the characteristics and the traits of each generation. And even when you had different inheritance particles, what we would call different genes and different versions of those genes present in an individual, they would still remain discrete. And it was the interaction between those discrete inheritance particles, or discrete genes, and the versions of those alleles, something that we refer to as alleles, would account for the particular traits and characteristics that every individual would have. And once you understood the basis for how they were passed from one generation to the next, you could make some predictions about what you could expect to see in subsequent generations. It is ironic that Mendel and Charles Darwin were contemporaries. We know that Mendel had a copy of Darwin's On the Origin of Species in German, and that he read it because he made lots of notes in the margins. So we know he was aware of what Darwin was talking about. And the one thing that Darwin could never explain in all of his explanation of evolution and natural selection was where the variation came from that was required for natural selection. Mendel's work explained where the variation came from. But apparently, Mendel never contacted Darwin, even though he knew what Darwin's thinking was, and he knew that Darwin had this problem with understanding where the variation came from. And we feel that Darwin also knew about Mendel's work. It's not as if Mendel's work was completely ignored during Mendel's lifetime. It was largely ignored during Mendel's lifetime, however, and was not really recognized for its value until 1901. Unfortunately, Mendel had been dead for about 20 years at that point. So he never really got the credit during his lifetime for the work that he did. But it seems like Darwin also had at least some idea of what Mendel had discovered, but because Mendel's explained everything in terms of probabilities and mathematics, very few people understood exactly what Mendel was saying at that point in time. And apparently Darwin was one of those who was not able to understand the significance of what Mendel was saying. So unfortunately, neither of them spoke to the other. Mendel never really left Brno very much. He left a couple of times after he had completed his research to give a couple of talks, but he never really left Brno very much. And eventually he would become the abbot of the monastery. And that basically spelt the end of his scientific career. And Darwin basically did not leave the United Kingdom after he returned from his voyage on the Beagle. So they never really talked to each other, never met, and they never exchanged letters. And that's pretty obvious because we have all of Darwin's correspondence. He kept copies of every letter he ever sent, and he kept all the copies of the letters he received. And there is no evidence that Mendel and Darwin exchanged any letters about their work. And so neither of them really were able to provide the missing part of the puzzle to the other's work. It would not be until 1920, 1925, somewhere in there, that someone would propose merging the work of Mendel and Darwin together in what is known as the modern synthesis, so that you now have a coherent model of how both evolution and natural selection work, and where the source of variation that natural selection and evolution depend upon actually come from on the basis of Mendel's work. It's kind of unfortunate that they were not able to exchange ideas in a way that they could understand each other's work in detail, particularly for Darwin. But that was the nature of things. So I'm giving you a little bit more history than perhaps you were expecting, but I think it's important to understand the significance of this, because this is not an unusual event in science, where people have solutions to someone's problem, but because it's not communicated in the right fashion, or it's not communicated at all in some cases, that missing piece of information goes unnoticed, and it's left to other people later in time to actually recognize the significance of the work and merge the ideas together to create something that is far stronger and a better explanation of the way life works. Anyway, let's continue talking about Mendel's work, because this is kind of important. So Mendel chose to use garden peas. The book says he probably chose to use garden peas on this basis. Actually, he did choose to use garden peas for a couple of reasons. This was not an accidental choice. The first reason was because garden peas come in a huge number of varieties. People have been growing garden peas for hundreds of years now. And so there are a large number of varieties, and those varieties have some very distinctive characteristics that you can take a look at. Mendel didn't just arbitrarily choose any characteristic. He chose 7 characteristics in total, and each of those characteristics had what we refer to as 2 traits. So for instance, one characteristic was flower color, and this is the one that is most famous. And the 2 traits were the purple trait and the white trait for flower color. And this was the case for all of the characteristics that he chose. For all 7 characteristics, there were 2 distinctive traits. And the reason why he did this was so that there could be no confusion about what he was looking at. So in the case of flower color, they were either purple or they were white. There was nothing in between. This was not a snapdragon case where the red and the white give pink. This was in the peas mixing purple and white didn't give you some lighter shade of purple. You either had purple or you had white. And this was true of all the characteristics that he looked at. And as I said, there were 7 in total, including seed color, seed shape or seed texture, pod color, pod shape, the height of the plant, the location on the plant where the flowers came from. These were all characteristics that he looked at. And it took Mendel and 2 assistants 2 years to develop all of the plants that he was going to need to do his experiments. So he wasn't working with just arbitrary plants. He deliberately set out to create the plants that he needed to do his experiments. And much of the protocols that he established for doing genetics experiments are the same protocols that we continue to use today. And this is one of the reasons why Mendel is very correctly referred to as the father of modern genetics. Apart from the 2 laws of inheritance that he developed that form the basis for future experimentation and development of other ideas, he also established the basic way you go about doing genetics experiments. And so he is very correctly referred to as the father of modern genetics. Now, there were some other characteristics of garden peas that also made them attractive to him. So one of the things that we know about garden peas is that the pollen, which is the male part, the equivalent of sperm, is able to fertilize the eggs of the same flower. And so this is called self-pollination or self-fertilization. This is not true of all plants. About 50% of all plants are capable of self-pollination or self-fertilization. But in the case of garden peas, the pollen is compatible with the eggs within the same flower. And this is what allowed Mendel to create what we refer to today in genetics experiments as pure breeding parents. So what is meant by that? It means that generation after generation, these pure breeding plants produce only one version of the characteristics. So if we refer to flower color again, a plant that is pure breeding for purple flowers will produce offspring that have purple flowers, and every generation thereafter, the only flower color that is present is purple flowers. In other words, the only option, the only possibility for these plants is to produce purple flowers. We would say today that the purple flower color is fixed in these plants. That would be the correct genetic term for that situation. And it was very easy for Mendel to do this. Well, relatively easy for Mendel to do this, because if he wanted to guarantee that only the purple pollen would pollinate the purple flower, he could simply stick a paper bag over the top of it, and therefore no foreign pollen could get in. And so he created pure breeding plants for all of the traits of all of the characteristics that he was looking at, all 7 of them, and the 2 traits for each of those characteristics. So he had pure breeding purple flowers, he had pure breeding white flowers, and so on. Then we also know, because we have the record of his experiments, that he created pure breeding parents that were pure breeding for a combination of 2 traits for 2 characteristics. This is why it took him so long to set up for his experiments. As I said, Mendel and 2 assistants took 2 years to create all of the plants necessary to do all of the experiments that he was going to be doing. And then it took him another 4 or 5 years to carry out all the experiments as he was following the different traits from one generation to the next. Now, it's not only that the plants are capable of self-fertilization, it's that peas produce the next generation relatively quickly. About 3 months from pollination to seeds for the next generation and germination of those seeds to give the next generation of plants. And seeing as how Mendel was a monk and had duties at the monastery, having some time away from the plants while he was waiting for the seeds to develop and then planting out the seeds and waiting for the next generation of plants to grow, allowed him to continue on with his duties as a monk within the monastery. And because peas can pretty much look after themselves, it meant he didn't have to spend a lot of time caring for the plants. And he was working in a greenhouse, which meant he could do his experiments all year round. That was another advantage to having a greenhouse. So when he wanted to do his actual experiments, the peas came to the rescue again. Because if he wanted to transfer pollen from one plant to another plant, to make sure that only the pollen that he was interested in is actually able to carry out the pollination step, he said all he had to do was simply remove the male part of the flower. That's the stamens. And that's easy to do. Pair of scissors, snip, snip, and you can cut the stamens out. And if you do it early enough before the pollen develops, then you make sure that the pollen that would have been produced by that plant is no longer able to do the pollination. That then gives you the opportunity to bring in the pollen that you want. And you can simply do that with a paintbrush, as the illustration shows here. So you brush the stamens with the paintbrush of the flower that you want the pollen from, and then you brush that pollen on to what is referred to as the stigma, which is on top of the carpel, that is the female part of the plant. And then the pollen will eventually fertilize the seeds down in the ovaries of the plant. Fertilize the eggs down in the ovaries of the plant. And eventually those will develop in the seeds, each containing a little embryonic plant that will, when the seed is exposed to water, germinate and start growing again and produce the next generation of offspring. And so Mendel was able to control which pollen was doing the pollination. He was also very, very careful in how he carried out his experiments. You can see here that he's transferring white pollen to a purple flower. Well, that's one way you can do this. The alternative is to take purple pollen and apply it to a white flower. And Mendel was smart enough to realize that he needed to do both, what we would refer to today as a reciprocal cross, because just transferring white pollen to a purple flower and looking at those results may not tell you what's going on, because it may make a difference which direction you transfer the pollen. Transferring purple pollen to white flower may actually give you a different result from transferring white pollen to a purple flower. And because he didn't know whether it would make a difference or not, he realized he needed to do both. And as I said, we call that a reciprocal cross these days. And that's something that we still do. So Mendel is establishing all of these protocols for how you do a genetics experiment. He also assigned titles or designations to each generation of plants that he was working with. So the original flowers that he started with, these pure breeding parents, he refers to or referred to as the P generation, P for parent. Let me fire up the pen here. Sure. So here's the parental generation. So when you breed two of these together, that produces what today we refer to as the F1, or to give it its full name, first filial. That's just a fancy way of saying the first offspring generation. Now, Mendel was smart enough to realize that he couldn't just stop there. The geneticists of Mendel's day did stop there. They would take their parental plants, breed them, look at or their parental generation, whatever organisms they were working with, let's say plants for the sake of argument. And they would breed those together and they would get their offspring and they would look at those and they would analyze the offspring and reach conclusions on the basis of that. That's why blending was a commonly held idea. We'll come back and we'll revisit the snapdragons and talk about blending a little bit later in the chapter. And you'll see that there is blending, but it wasn't the blending that the geneticists of Mendel's day were implying. Mendel realized that if you stopped with the first generation, you could make some conclusions. But what he also realized was that if he really wanted to understand what was going on here, he really needed to go one step further. And so he crossed So he realized that what he really needed to do was go this one step further, cross two of the F1s, or more likely, allow an F1 to self-pollinate, because that's the equivalent of crossing two F1s. But based on his notebooks, the few that we have left, because unfortunately a lot of his notebooks got thrown out by the monks when he passed away and they were cleaning out his quarters. They unfortunately threw out many of his experimental notebooks. We only have a few of them left. But based on what we have, we know that he not only allowed F1s to self-pollinate, but he did actually transfer pollen between two F1s. Again, being very cautious, wanting to know that doing it one way would give the same result as doing it the other way. So whether it was self-pollination or transferring pollen between two F1 plants, the end result of this is what is known as the second filial generation, or the F2 generation. He realized he needed to do that to really understand what the inheritance patterns looked like. And you'll understand why when we talk about his first set of experiments, which we will do shortly. So this is the basic setup of Mendel's genetics experiments. So before we move on to talk about Mendel's experiments, let's take a quick break. We've been going for a little while. If you want to walk away and just take a break, feel free to do so. But I'll meet you back here on the other side of the break with the answer to this concept question. You decide to breed two purebred dogs. I've got a spelling error there. It should be the number 2. What are the correct genetic terms for your dogs and the subsequent 2 generations? I'll see you on the other side of the break.